Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Once Upon a Pastime series. Mac McGee here, and we are getting ready for a night of baseball history. We do this usually on Thursday nights here in the off season. Good to see you, Uncle Charlie. And tonight's, I'll put it up there one more time. Tonight's show is What's in a Name? And what we're going to do is we're going to go through all the different names of Major League Baseball. How did they come about getting these names? I'll set the first slide up for you so you can see what's going on. And there's going to be ones that we're not going to go through because it's very obvious, right? Like, we're not going to go through why the Los Angeles Angels are called the Los Angeles Angels when the name of the city is Los Angeles, right? But most of them are going to be, I think, informative for you. And you may even know why the current team that you follow or are aware of is named what they're named, but you may not know the entire history of it. And so that's what we're going to go into tonight, and good to see some of the people jumping in here. We got Jeep and Uncle Charlie. I'm sure others will be coming in here as we go along. Tomorrow we will do the Braves Country today and MLB today. We'll go over all the signings. I know you're seeing a lot of stuff being put up about the Atlanta Braves. We'll go over that on Braves Country today. That's 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow right here on Braves Country Radio. And then, of course, on MLB today, which is 9 a.m. Eastern, we're going to be going over all of Major League Baseball. There's been a ton of movement. Nothing big, but there have been interesting moves. And so we move on from that and get you ready for Once Upon a Pastime series. As, once again, these are going to be going on at 6 o'clock. We try to keep them to about an hour. Tomorrow night, remember, it's Braves Country Theater, and we try to get those done by 8 o'clock because there's a lot of football that tends to start at 8 p.m. Eastern on Friday night, so we try to get out of the way for those of y'all who are also football fans. The other thing that I do want to touch on, Ronald Acuna Jr. playing down in Venezuela. All you need to know is that we're going to carry some of his games. He is not expected to be in action yet. That his team has started playing, but it sounds like they're going to play next weekend. He's coming to them next weekend. So if that ends up being the case, we will end up trying to carry some games here and there, and we're just waiting until an official announcement before we commit to that. It's the only place that I know of you're going to be able to get the English-speaking version. There are Spanish channels that are bringing people the game. I don't believe anybody is trying to do it on the English speaking, so we're going to do that. We're going to try to do other games down in the Caribbean series, but obviously we're going to focus on when Ronald Acuna Jr. is playing, because that really is the big name that's playing down there, and he's playing once again for his team down in Venezuela. So, like I said, I expect us to carry a game sometime late next week. I'm just waiting for the official let's go. So, there you go. Good to see you, Daniel, and see the land. And, of course, we already said hi to Jeep and Charlie. So, let's go ahead and start this One Upon a Pastime series. And with that being said, we're going to start off, and yes, we are going to go over the Braves, but we're going to start off with the team from Brooklyn that is now called the Los Angeles Dodgers. But what you see up on your screen here is something very, very interesting on how they first started. Now, when the Dodgers, and it's going to be a little confusing because we will continuously refer to teams as who they are called today. But when the Dodgers first started playing baseball in Brooklyn, it was in 1883, and they called themselves the Brooklyn Grays. And this is very common. I didn't use a slide for this because this is a very common thing. Most teams named their team after the color of the jersey or something on their jersey, like the Boston Red Stockings, like the Boston Red Caps, et cetera, et cetera. So they were called the Brooklyn Grays, and that was because their uniform was gray and usually blue writing. That's why the Dodgers to this day have the gray on their road uniforms and have the Dodger blue, and that they've become famous for. But they were called the Brooklyn Grays in 1883 and then changed their name to the Brooklyn Atlantics in 1884. And that's kind of obvious on why they were doing that. They were playing in the Atlantic League. They were the Brooklyn team. Which you had a lot of the things that went on. And by the way, they went back to the Brooklyn Grays for 3 more seasons, 1885 to 1887. Okay? But what you had for a lot of these teams is they bounced their names back and forth, and they also tried to identify with where they were and what league they were in. It's because when they would advertise, come see the game, there was a lot of confusion because a lot of your major cities had multiple teams, kind of like the way the Yankees and the Mets do today. But at that time, it was very common to have multiple teams in your larger markets because you didn't have a lot of teams in the major leagues that played in smaller cities. So, and at that point, obviously, the larger cities were not as numerous as they are today in the United States. So you had 3-4 teams playing in New York, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they would sometimes distinguish their team by the name of the association they were in or league that they were in. And that's why you ended up with teams like the Boston Americans, because it was the Boston team in the American League. And so a lot of times what you had was you had official names, and then you had the nicknames that these teams went about with from the newspapers. And so we'll get into some of that. But for instance, it's not commonplace anymore, but let's say the Atlanta Braves started getting a nickname from one of the local sports writers and would constantly call them Team whatever. We'll just say Team X. And the fans get to know to call them Team X, even though technically they're still the Braves. So it was a lot of that going on. Like I said, you don't get that today because the confusion is no longer there because of all the added media that covers all the games. Okay. In 1888, and that's the picture that you have on the screen, they turned into the Brooklyn Bridegrooms. Okay? And it was the Brooklyn Bridegrooms that ended up... The reason why they named their team the Brooklyn Bridegrooms was one simple reason, and one simple reason only. The Brooklyn Bridegrooms named their team from the Brooklyn Grays because 6 guys that offseason got married. Now, eventually they changed their name to the Brooklyn Grooms in 1891, and that lasted for 5 seasons to 1895. So you think how funny that is today that some kind of trend happens. I mean, if you're an NBA fan, it would literally be like calling one of the NBA teams involved in the banana boat incident the Banana Boats, right? Or the Cancuns, because that's where everybody goes to vacation. So this is what you had going on, and the names were very fluid, and you would see them change all the time. So from 1891 to 1895, the Brooklyn, what are now the Los Angeles Dodgers, were called the Brooklyn Grooms after being the Bridegrooms. So you're talking about for 8 seasons, they were either the Bridegrooms or the Grooms. Now you're seeing a trend here where they're shortening the names, right? In 1896, they went back to the Bridegrooms once again. So from 96 to 98, so realistically, 11 years, they were the Bridegrooms, the Grooms, and then back to the Bridegrooms. And so these were the official names of these teams. And what you ended up having here is that in 1899, as you can see on your screen, these are the Brooklyn Superbas, or some people pronounced it at the time Superbas. It depended on what part of the city you were from. But what you're looking at, this was a traveling circus. And the Hanson brothers, I believe it was Hanlon brothers, ended up being the guys that ran the Superbas, which was a traveling circus. Well, their new manager that came over and started running what is now the Dodgers, his last name was Hanlon. He had no tie to this traveling circus, but because of the outright popularity of this traveling circus, when Baltimore shut down their team in 1899, we'll get into that in a second, a lot of the very good players came up to Brooklyn for jobs. And so it was like melding a super team together, kind of like the Dodgers of today in Los Angeles, right? They put a super team together. But this was a defunct franchise that came up, and several players joined Brooklyn. And so the running joke is that they had built a super team, and so now they are the Superbas, almost like this traveling circus that was very, very popular at the time. That team name, and by the way, they won the NL pennant in 1889 and 1900. So this wasn't some, and remember the World Series began in 1903. This wasn't some tongue-in-cheek. This was a really good baseball team in the late 1800s. That name would stick until the official change of the name would be the Trolley Dodgers. And you see this here. This is an example of the trolleys that they were named after. The Trolley Dodgers was a nickname for Brooklyn. Now, in the area where Brooklyn was playing their games, and this is before Ebbets Field was built on Pigtown, as they called it in Brooklyn. The entire area of Brooklyn, it wasn't just where the actual stadium was itself, which has been misrepresented in some instances where they were trying to say that fans of that time were dodging trolleys to get to that game. That's not true, but the entire borough of Brooklyn, they were having to move quickly through the streets because these new electric trolleys were hauling ass through the streets, whereas before you had much slower traffic, usually something drawn by horse. So they became known as the Trolley Dodgers, and they took to that name for 1911 to 1912. The Trolley Dodgers implied the dangers posed by trolley cars in Brooklyn, and they switched to electric in 1892, but it became a known thing. And so the name was eventually shortened to the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1913. You think that would be the end of it? You think that would end it all? And there we are now the Brooklyn Dodgers and eventually become the Los Angeles Dodgers. No. In 1914, the Brooklyn Dodgers changed their name again, and it would last from 1914 to 1931, 18 seasons. And it was named after the longtime manager, and this was very commonplace. The manager or the owner took on the nickname of the team. His last name was Robinson, Wilbert Robinson, and so they became known as the Robins. Now, of course, people think of the Robins as the bird, but it was intended for the last name of the manager. Now, a lot of logos and whatnot that were put in the paper did have that kind of moniker on there as far as having a Robin, but it was literally named after the team's manager. Then they become the Brooklyn Dodgers one more time in 1932. That would last until 1958, where they moved out to Los Angeles and became the Los Angeles Dodgers in Brooklyn fans' hearts forever. All right, the next team up on the docket, and this one will get you a little closer to what we were talking about. And by the way, this is a picture of Brooklyn back when they were called the Grays, and they just wrote Brooklyn across the chest. I could never find anything that showed them actually having Grays on the name, but it was written in the papers, right? So there's Brooklyn, and then here we go. This takes place in 1871, and the Boston Red Stockings which later eventually become Atlanta, play their first season. That was in 1871. That began the NAA, which most of those teams that were in there end up transferring over into the National League. The NAA, they were the premier baseball league from 1871 to 1875. In 1876, the National League was created, and the rest is baseball history, right? But in 1871, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, who were formed in 1869 in Cincinnati, obviously, they were the first openly professional baseball team. Before that, there was a commonplace of guys taking pride, just like in football, where you eventually get the National Football League. They took pride in being amateurs. In 1869, it broke that. Major League Baseball became the driving force in sports in America. This predates football being king of America by about 100 years. Football doesn't really take off until televisions get put in everybody's home. So in 1869, you have the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and they go on an 81-game winning streak. And I want to say they also won, it was something insane. Like, in 130 games, they won all but one or two. But what sent them down was in 1870, on June 14th, they ended up moving into the New York area. This is the Cincinnati team, on a barnstorming tour. And they played an extra innings game. It was the first extra inning game known in what is considered now Major Baseball. They could have decided to go ahead and play this New York team to a tie, but they decided we're going to try extra innings. They lost that game by a run. Most of the Cincinnati, at the time baseball fans were called cranks, most of those folks started to not attend Cincinnati games because the allure of the unbeatable team, almost like a Harlem Globetrotter type team, but they were actually playing games. This wasn't a stunt. What ended up taking place was the fans quit coming to the games. And after the 1870 season, manager Harry Wright of the Cincinnati team, he moves along with his brother to Boston, and several of the players come with him. And the Cincinnati Red Stockings become the Boston Red Stockings. They are not the same ownership group, but the players from Cincinnati go to Boston. And they moved to Boston, and it was all what everybody in the United States has done forever. It was because of money, right? And so they move there, and they become the Boston Red Stockings. 1871, Boston Red Stockings in the National Association, as most people called it. It was technically called the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, the NAPBBP, but most people called it the National Association, the NA. And they dominated the NA. They won 4 of the first 5 pennants, and back then that's all you could do. So when you see me reference the fact that the Atlanta Braves organization has 16 world titles, it dates back to this team, because at the time when they won their pennant, that was it. They couldn't win anything else. There was no World Series, so they were crowned world champions at that time. The World Series doesn't come around for 30 years after these guys were playing. So the way I look at it is, and I wouldn't take it away from any of the other teams that won it, if you finish the season as the champion of your league, you're the damn champion. That's it. So from 1876 to 1882, they move into the National League. The Cincinnati Redlegs end up coming in, and they were constantly being referred to as the Red Stockings as well. While that is going on, the Boston Red Stockings changed their name to the Red Caps because there were two reasons. A, there was a belief that the dye that was being used in their socks was unhealthy, so the ownership wanted to get away from that. And then the other thing was they started wearing red caps. I believe I have a picture of it. Let me see. Do I have that? Is it this way? Yeah, there we go. So it's not a great picture, but you can kind of see where that cap is a little lightly tinted. Because of the washing, they always ended up turning more of like a light red, almost to pink, not quite pink, but when they got closer to pink, they would re-dye it. But this is a painting from that time. They stay the Red Caps for 7 seasons, and then in 1883, they become the Boston Bees. And this is a picture of the Boston Bees from that era. I'm sorry, Bean Eaters. The Boston Bean Eaters. Got ahead of myself. It was an informal nickname derived from the city's long-standing nickname of being Bean Town. So they were the Boston Bean Eaters. And the name was basically changed not only on a lot of the monikers and the marquees, but also in the papers to kind of reflect that they are no longer from a bunch of guys from Cincinnati now playing in Boston, that they are truly Boston's team. And so that lasted, like I said, all the way technically till 1908. Now, nicknames would always fold in. And so you would get these different nicknames, but I'm going off of what was the actual name of that time. The official name. In 1907, you get the Boston Doves, and that would last until 1910. And they go more to a blue because the ownership wanted to distinguish themselves as being new ownership, so they wore more of a blue, usually a dark blue. This isn't a perfect color on it, but a dark blue. So they were the Boston Doves for 4 seasons. Why were they the Doves? Because the ownership was led by a group called the Dovey brothers, George Dovey and John Dovey, so they became the Doves. So you're starting to see a trend here where it depended on who was running the team, who was the star of the team, who was the manager, the owner, et cetera, usually took on the team's name. We don't do that anymore. Now, it does not matter if the owner of said Major League Baseball team, or for instance, the Padres owner died last offseason. They didn't decide to change the name. It's still the Padres. So, what would be more likely to happen if we were living 130 years ago in the baseball world? The LA Dodgers probably would eventually have been called the Ohtanis or the Showtimes or the Shoheis, something to reflect the fact that they had Shohei Ohtani. The Braves probably would have ended up somehow with some version of Ronald Acuna Jr., or they would have taken on some new moniker because they're in the South and in the state of Georgia. But that has really died off. That we really haven't seen that kind of a knee-jerk name change reaction in the last 50, 60 years. So they become the Boston Doves, and then in 1911, they become the Boston Rustlers. And the Boston Rustlers end up, for just 1 season, and it was because the team was sold to William Hepburn Russell before the 1911 season, so they decided to change the name the Rustlers, and I didn't get a very good picture off of that. It just didn't show up, but from my understanding, the jerseys were all just said Boston across. I couldn't find anything said Rustlers. There were some really bad pictures of caps that had R's that they wore on a couple of occasions, but remember, they were only the Rustlers for 1 year. And so in 1912, they become the Boston Braves. And why do they become the Boston Braves? And you're looking at this hall, this hall, and you're like, what the hell is this? Where's an Indian logo? Why were they called the Boston Braves? They became known as the Boston Braves because the team was sold to James Gaffney in 1912, a New York City politician with strong ties to what you're looking on your screen at of Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall, for those of y'all who don't know the historic factor of Tammany Hall in New York City, it was known to be one of the top driving forces in the political machine in New York. In 1786, it was built and it was incorporated by 1789 as the Tammany Society, but it was always called Tammany Hall. And with that being said, it became the main political machine, and it played a major role in controlling New York City and New York State politics at that time. And by the end of its power, it was the driving force that directed the Democratic Party in New York City. So he was involved in that, and they used a Native American chief as its emblem at Tammany Hall. So Gaffney, through club president John Montgomery Ward, and some of you older folks will remember Montgomery Ward, it was a store back in the day. I'm trying to think of it was more of like a Kohl's, like a J.C. Penney's type. John Montgomery Ward helped name the team with the new owner Gaffney to the Braves to reflect the connections to Tammany Hall. And I haven't used it in a while, but maybe I'll use it this season. But you'll hear me from time to time make connections to Tammany Hall and the Braves, and that's why. Because realistically, we are named, the team you know and love your whole life, it's named after this building in New York City. I know it's actually named off the emblem, but it was because of that building in New York City and the emblem that was inside. In 1936 to 1940, they become the Boston Bees. And yeah, Jeep, it was a department store. I was just trying to think of a good parallel for today's. And today, most people more think of like Target and Walmart and whatnot, but it really was. It's kind of a dying thing nowadays. You don't really have true department stores anymore, but the closest thing that we could call it would be, either Kohl's or J.C. I don't even know if they still have J.C. Penney's, but Sears, although Sears has branched out on a lot of different things. So in 1936 to 1945 seasons in Boston, they go to the Boston Bees, and you see the jerseys there. And it's kind of funny, if they would have kept that name, it really would have tied into the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in Atlanta, and no one would have really thought anything of it. But the reason why the new fans, the new owners held a contest with the fans and to change the team's image, because in 1935 they had a disastrous season. So in the off season they decided to change the name, and after I think it was 1,300 fan submissions, they went with the Bees, and they changed their colors to navy blue and yellow, very very close to what the Yellow Jackets use today. And by 1941, they have reverted the name back to the Braves because it just never stuck. The fans didn't really get into it. And in 1941, they become the Boston Braves. Now, you'll see the Boston Braves. Now, that's a logo from the original 1912. But the reason why they reverted back to it is because new ownership took over, and they wanted more of something from the past to bring the fans out, because basically saying we're going to take this back to where it originally began. Not really true. If you want to take it back where it really originally began, it would have been the Red Stockings. But by that time, the Red Sox and the Red Legs, now just shortened to the Reds, they were ingrained into Major League Baseball. So it was going to be very difficult to go back to anything with the Red Legs or the Red Caps, Red Stockings or Red Caps. So they go to the Boston Braves. And at that point, this is the logo from 1912. But they held that logo pretty significantly, along with others, from 1941 and even into when they were in Milwaukee, you don't really see it appear in the city of Atlanta. But that logo right there is one that you'll see on jerseys and all kinds of stuff throughout the years. That is another logo that they used typically on the ball caps for the new Boston Braves, which is the old Boston Braves. And they made that B like that to signify they were different than Brooklyn, which had a B, and of course the Red Sox, which still have a B. So that's why you have the weird B there. It really looks more like a Detroit Tiger type of D. This is the reason why. It's because they were always trying to make sure that when they were trying to differentiate themselves, that people didn't get it confused, which is really odd because back then you didn't get a lot of jerseys and ball caps and whatnot that was sold like it is today. But they still wanted to separate themselves. We go to Milwaukee, and this is where this first shows up here, this version of the Braves logo. And it changes a little bit when you get to Atlanta in 1966, but if you look at it, it's realistically the same logo. There was just a little different coloring, and this is actually one that was being used by the 1980s, so it's a little more modernized. And then this is a look that I wanted to show you. See if I can see. Every time I do that, it moves it. But you get kind of a look at the different jerseys of the Braves of the past. And of course, most of y'all will recognize them. This, if I can get this thing, here we go. On the left, that's the old Boston jerseys, almost from the original. You got to realize in the first early days, they didn't have a lot of definition on the jerseys, so that's why a lot of these start picking up in the 20th century. And then this is a Braves in Boston jersey. And then, of course, this is when they end up in this right here, this one here on the that I'm centering in on. That is from 1957. That was the second World Series title for the Braves in Milwaukee. So there you have that. All right. Other teams of the area. From 1901 to 1965, you had the Atlanta Crackers. And they were in the Southern Association. They were a minor league team for, like I said, 65 years. And the reason why they were named that, and they played at Ponce de Leon Park, and it was a really popular fixture in Atlanta, but the term was a reference to Georgia Crackers, and it's much different than Florida Crackers. The Georgia Cracker was a term used for descendants of settlers in Georgia that became popular for the recipe of the saltine cracker. So that's why it's literally for an actual cracker when you see the Atlanta Crackers. You hear the term Florida Cracker, it was cracking the whips to move the steer throughout the state of Florida. So it's two different things, even though they sound alike, but the C and the K make the big difference. There was also, did I end up getting a good logo for that? Yeah, there it is. This is the Atlanta Black Crackers, and they were the Negro League team in Atlanta. And you'll see this a lot with the teams of that time in the Negro Leagues. They wanted to have a tie to get fans to come to the team, but they also wanted to make sure that you understood that you were going to the Negro League game. So that's the Atlanta Black Crackers. The Atlanta Crackers logo is very similar. The Black Crackers played from 39 from 19 to 39. So 1919 to 1939. And then there was a second franchise that used the same name from 1943 to, I believe it was 19. I haven't miswritten here. I believe it was just under 20 years, but they started playing in 1943. see if I have anything else in here. I think that's it. So I couldn't get all the pictures because it was going to crash everything, but there you have that. Now, getting into some of the other names that I thought y'all would have some interest in. You have the Birmingham. Well, first let's get started with, in 1918, there was a Negro League team, and they named their team the Black Giants. That was named after the Nashville Standard Giants that became the Nashville Elite Giants, and then eventually in 1938, I think I missaid that a second ago, 1938, the Baltimore Elite Giants end up going, and so they ended up playing from 1919 to roundabout, it was close to 50 years. The Birmingham Black Barons originated from the city's industrial heritage, and I know you've heard of the Birmingham Black Barons, or at least if you've been around any kind of baseball and Negro League baseball, they are very well known. You also had the Birmingham Barons themselves, okay? But the Black Barons and the Barons were named after the coal barons in the late 1800s in the city of Birmingham. In 1885, now this one I found very interesting because I always wanted to know why they were called this. In 1885 to 1915, you had the Cuban Giants, and they were a Negro League team. And they ended up calling themselves the Black Giants to differentiate themselves from the New York baseball Giants of the major leagues. But then there was a team that came around. This is the confusing part. Just 2 years after the Cuban Giants, and they were, and by the way, that was a way to try to appeal to the white crowds in the area to try to get them to go to games. They were not from Cuba. They were African Americans, Black Americans. And they were playing in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were trying to get folks to come to the games, and so they were referring to themselves as Cuban. And then you ended up having 2 years later another team in the Negro Leagues with a lot of their players that left for more money, and they started calling themselves the Cuban X-Giants, which is really strange because you think about it, it would literally be the equivalent of nowadays if Freddie Freeman joined the Cubs and the Cubs quit calling themselves the Chicago Cubs, but because he's up there with Dansby Swanson, maybe Max Fried goes over the Cubs and they start calling themselves the Chicago X-Braves. It's the same exact thing. And so also Negro League teams, the Detroit Stars, and they evidently that was not tied to any single event. But if you know the name Rube Foster, he was an owner of the Stars, and it was all about marketing. He wanted people to come out and believe that they were about to see stars on the field. So that was why that happened. The Kansas City Monarchs, most of y'all should know who that is. That's where the great Satchel Paige and the great Buck O'Neil played. They got their name from the long so it was the Kansas City Monarchs, and it was, the name was derived because a couple of the players had influence into the team's name, and they wanted to let everybody know that they were an elite team. So it was almost like a play off the Nashville the Nashville Elites. But what they were trying to do is say that the Monarchs were the kings of Negro League baseball. And Buck O'Neil, if you never heard me talk about him before, he's one of my favorite players of all time. He's got a great book. If you've never checked it out, it's called I Was Right on Time. Highly, highly suggest Buck O'Neil's book. Now, one has nothing to do with the other, but I did find it interesting that the two teams, because I always wondered about this, how did they end up with a very similar name? The Kansas City Royals, who are now in Kansas City, Missouri, obviously, and that's where the Monarchs played years before them. A fan named Sandport named the team the Royals, and it was one of these things. And this is very popular back then, by the way. In fact, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and I remember when they had the Bulls, which was a USFL team in the early 80s, a football team. And before they played their first game, they had a contest where folks would mail in suggestions for team names, and they picked one. In fact, as a young kid, I entered the contest. Now, they went with the Bulls because the last name of the owner, Fred Bullard. So this all goes back to baseball, right? But I thought they should have been named the Admirals because it's a Navy town, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways. But they go with the Royals, and it beat out two other team names. Listen to these two team names. It was almost not the Kansas City Royals. It was almost the Kansas City Cowpokes or the Kansas City Mules. But he wrote at the time, Kansas City's new baseball team should be called the Royals because of Missouri's billion-dollar livestock income. Kansas City's position as the nation's leading stocker and feeder market should be known for their American Royal Parade and Pageant. It was essentially named after a parade. But when you see the logo of the Kansas City Royals, had nothing to do with that, right? And it's kind of funny, but you do these deep dives and you learn how they how these names become to be. Good to see you, Gary and Rich. See what else we got. Tree Nug, Jeep and Charlie, Gary the Real McCoy, Ladarius. Good to see you. Yes, Kumar's in here. Good to see everybody. If I missed anybody, I do apologize. I'll try to keep it up. I'm having to read as I go along, so I'm not as involved in that. Tomorrow night's game, by the way, 6 p.m. You'll see it come on a tad early, like 5:55. That's because it runs a little longer than 2 hours, and I want to make sure we get the game in before 8 o'clock because there's several sporting events that are starting. But it's Braves versus Phillies. It's from the 1980s. So that's my wheelhouse right there, right? That's where I grew up on. So I'm excited to see it because I have not watched the game, but I'm excited to see guys like, Rafael Ramirez, Dale Murphy. I would assume that we might get an Oberkfell sightings, all those guys. All right. So now we go to the Cleveland, which are now called the Guardians. Good to see you, Victory Garden. So the Cleveland Guardians, and this is the part that you're going to understand why Cleveland fans were so irate when they changed the name to the Guardians. So if you follow the history of this, you'll understand. Originally, the first known name for the team was called the Cleveland Spiders. And that was 1887 to 1891. That was not the same franchise, but it does have a link to it. Okay? Because from 1887 to 1891, Luis Sockalexis played for the Cleveland Spiders, and he was one of the better players of the time. We'll get into his stats in a second. He was one of the better players of the time. He was a crowd favorite. And so this leads to the fact that he was Native American, and it's believed he was the first true Native American player to break into the Major Leagues. The Cleveland Spiders at the time were considered Major League Baseball. The franchise collapsed, but it was in the same area, okay? In 1896, a team by the name of the Columbus, it was Buckeyes, it was Senators, and we all know why Buckeyes, or at least maybe you don't know, but there's the Buckeye tree in Columbus, and the reason why it's been called the Buckeye and the Buckeye State is because of that tree. The Buckeye, there's a little nut that falls from it, and the nut itself resembles the eye of a deer, and that's why it's got the nickname. Okay, but then they also had the Columbus Senators. They end up moving to Grand Rapids, Michigan, just across the pond. They become known as the Prodigals. The name's origin is a reference to the biblical parable of the prodigal son, symbolizing a team that had been through previous name changes. Okay? Now is when they come to Cleveland in 1900. And they become the Cleveland Lakeshores. By the way, I really like that name. I honestly think they should have kept that from the jump. But the Cleveland Lakeshores. If you've ever paid attention to Cleveland sports, been through Cleveland, you know that it sits there right on that river, and that lakeshore, that wind that comes off of there, it is hell, especially during football season, during December and January and even into November. I always tell folks when they're asking us questions, whether it's fantasy football or picks against the spread, and they bring up Cleveland, I don't care if Cleveland's good or not that year. Always check the weather in Cleveland, because if the wind is kicking anywhere close to 30 miles plus, steer clear of the over. Steer clear of starting anybody in your fantasy league, because the wind is a real thing. But anyways, Cleveland Lakeshores. And then by 1901, they started wearing dark blue uniforms. So even though technically their name is the Cleveland Lakeshores, the local press starts calling them the Blues and the Bluebirds. And some of it has to do with the color. The other thing was, at the time, there were a lot of sporting teams in the Cleveland area of all sports that used birds as their nickname, some version of a bird. So they became the Bluebirds in the press, along with the Cleveland Blues. But it was because of the color of their caps and their jerseys. Cleveland Broncos. The Cleveland Plain dealer nicknamed them the Cleveland Broncos. That didn't really stick. At this time, they're still technically the Lakeshores. In 1903, they changed their name to the Naps, and that is because of Nap La Joy, Nap La Joy or Nap Lajoie, depends on where you lived in that area. Lajoie, I believe, was his preferred, but a lot of the writers at the time called him La Joy. So take it as it is, but we'll go with Lajoie. He was one of, if not the best player in baseball in 1903. And so they became the Cleveland Naps, and it was named by the fans. They were given an opportunity to come up with a nickname in the newspaper, and that was the one that they came out on. And the name was when they became the Cleveland Naps in 1902, 1903 opening day in Cleveland, a standing ovation of over 10,000 people, which at the time was a huge crowd, debuted in Cleveland to give a standing ovation to Nap Lajoie. And then they become the Cleveland Indians. And that was because in 1914, Nap retires, and they're looking for a new name. And the fans of the area wanted to give a tribute to the Native American baseball player Luis Sockalexis, who played for the Cleveland Spiders, never actually played for that franchise, but played in the city of Cleveland. And the name was officially adopted in 1915 as a way to honor him as the first Native American ball player. And they named him. They named the team the Cleveland Indians. Also, at that time, their ace pitcher was a Native American. His name was Chief Bender. Ended up in the Hall of Fame. Very dominant player. So that all intertwined to why they were called the Cleveland Indians. And then so listen to this for Luis Sockalexis. In his first season with the Spiders, Sockalexis hit .338. He also had, in college when he played at Holy Cross from 1895 to 1896, had a .444 batting average. He transferred to Notre Dame when his coach took the job at Notre Dame, but Notre Dame banned him from the campus because he was Native American. But he ended up getting on with the Cleveland Spiders professional baseball team, and his career batting average was .313, which is still pretty darn good. And you're talking about the dead ball era, right? Now, back then, you weren't swinging for the fences, so you were literally just trying to poke the ball over the infield. But still, he also had 16 stolen bases in 66 games that season. But what ends up happening to Sock Alexis, because of all the pressure and getting kicked out of leagues, et cetera, I know it's a cliche tale, but he ends up dying from alcoholism and gets run out of the league after 3 or 4 years because his batting averages start to drop. Everything starts to drop because he is on the sauce. Very common thing that took place back in those days. But that was one of the reasons why the Cleveland fans wanted to name the team the Indians to honor him. And then about 100 years later, a bunch of dopes gave pressure to Major League Baseball, and they named them the Guardians. And they named the Guardians after the little statue that sits on the bridge. But Chief Wahoo Garden came from the Cleveland Indians name. They ended up bringing in Chief Wahoo a little later, but it was Chief Bender is one of the best damn pitchers of his era. And he rarely gets talked about because he wasn't on a lot of great teams, but Chief Bender was elite. He was one of the very top pitchers of his time. But Wahoo was adored not only by the Native American community when the team first became named. You know, I actually saw a documentary recently where they're talking to Native Americans that are still pissed off about the fact that they've changed the names of all these teams, because basically, you know, between the Redskins and the Indians and whatnot, they're basically saying they're stealing our history and we're fading into the past. And obviously they don't want to do that. Now, as far as the Braves are concerned, even though they were named after Tammany Hall, they still work with the community in the Georgia area of Native American tribes, much like Florida State does in the state of Florida of Native American tribes, so that they're honoring the name the right way. Okay? But I think a lot of people thought Chief Wahoo was some kind of, you know, it was like a dig at them. No, it was because back then cartoons were very popular, and it's more of a historic look at the name of the time. Chief Wahoo wasn't necessarily made after Bender or Sock Alexis, but it went off of the name of the Cleveland Indians. All right, Boston Red Sox. I found this one pretty interesting. Now, they're also known as the Sox, the Bo Sox, the Old Town team. But the Boston Red Sox originally in 1901, they were founded and became the Boston Americans. And the reason why, if you remember me saying this earlier in the show, they were the American League Boston team. So they became the Boston Americans. The National League Boston team was the Braves. Braves now. Back then, in 1901, they were, what were they technically in 1901? Because they went through so many name changes. They were the Bean Eaters. But they named their team the Boston Americans to differentiate themselves from what most people would refer to as the Boston Nationals, which was the Braves organization. So, right after that, now they were also known as the Pilgrims, the Somersets, the Puritans. These are all nicknames given to them in the paper. In fact, when they talk about the 1903 World Series, most people refer to the Boston Americans' World Series appearance against the Pittsburgh Alleghenies, which at that point had become known as the Pittsburgh Pirates. They refer to them as the Boston Pilgrims, but technically they were still the Boston Americans because they were the American League team in Boston. In 1908, they changed the name to the Red Sox, and that was because owner John I. Taylor, bought the team, and following the lead of previous teams that had been known for the Red Stockings, like the Braves, he wanted the Red Sox to be named in 1908 after that kind of history. So he decided to go with the Red Sox and decided to use striking Red Sox on their jerseys. I mean, they were bright red. Like, think of like fire truck red when they first started playing. Very, very similar. It's supposedly even louder than what the Cincinnati Reds wear today. Now we know the Boston Red Sox being a deep red. At the time, it was a very bright red. And they were paying homage to the Braves Boston. What they were basically doing back then is they were competing for fans, and they were trying to get fans on the nostalgia. So they were trying to bring them over. And remember, the Braves at this point had changed their names 5-6 times, and so they started getting. Now, one of the main reasons why the Red Sox fans ended up going to more Red Sox games over the Braves games, and I know they changed their names 100 times, but I'm just using the name Braves, is because the Braves at one point they were charging 25 cents more a ticket, and the fans fled and went to Boston. And this was in 1901, 1902. By 1903, they win the World Series. They'd gotten all these fans who had jumped ship from the Bean Eaters over to the Red Sox, well, at the time were the Americans, and they got such a big following. It eventually leads to the Braves leaving Boston, because you then start getting years and years and decades of fans growing up on the Red Sox. But it all started because their tickets were 25 cents cheaper, and they were like, it's the same sport. Why are we paying more? So they went over to the Red Sox, which at the time were the Americans. So in 1903, let's talk about the New York Yankees real quick. 1903, the team was founded, the New York Yankees. At the time, they were known as the New York Highlanders, but they were also technically known, their technical name at the time, even though everyone always references Highlanders, they were the New York Americans, because they were the American League team in New York. Remember, you had the New York Giants, and those were the New York Nationals. So, in 1903, the home ballpark of the New York Americans was played at Hilltop Park, which was situated on highest points in Manhattan, and the name was a geographical reference to the team's elevation. So that's why they became known as the Highlands, the Highlanders. The official New York Americans eventually fades into the past, and they end up becoming the New York Yankees right after that in 1913. And that was, of course, derived from the Dutch word Yankee, which was Jankas, John Cheese. At one point, this was known as a derogatory term for Americans, but then they started embracing it, which really pissed off people across the pond. So they embraced it, and now it had a lot to do with the song Yankee Doodle Dandy and the Dutch nickname, which was Jan Kos, which is John Cheese, but nonetheless, they become the New York Yankees. The Baltimore Orioles. Now, this becomes confusing for a lot of teams. In 1894 to 1901, they are the Milwaukee Brewers, not those Milwaukee Brewers, separate organization. Now, of course, over the years, they've been known as the Birds, the O's, Black Magic. But the Baltimore Orioles, the Black Magic was the 1960s or early 70s reference, because they always wore black jerseys with the orange, and very, very dominant baseball team in that time period. But from 94 to 1901, they were in Milwaukee, and they were called the Brewers. This is the Baltimore Orioles organization that we know today. In 1902, they become the St. Louis Browns, named after the Brown Stockings. Now, for you football fans, it's not the same reference as the Cleveland Browns, who were named after their owner or part owner and head coach, Paul Brown, totally different situation. But the St. Louis Browns moved from Milwaukee from 1894 to 1901. They then become the St. Louis Browns, and they were one of the most dreadful franchises in baseball history. Okay? In 1954, they leave St. Louis and become the Orioles. And the reason why they became the Orioles, first of all, the name had been used before. More on that in a second. But the bird's name, the Baltimore Oriole, the orange and black colors, which is where the Orioles get their colors, their uniform. The bird themselves, it was said that reminded early settlers of the colors on the coat of arms for the Calvert family, the Lords of Baltimore. So the bird was dubbed the Baltimore bird and eventually became known as the Oriole. When the St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore in 1954, by the way, the owners chose the name Orioles to connect to the city of the past. Now, there was a Baltimore Oriole team from 1882 to 1899, and they were called the Baltimore Orioles, and they are one of the most famed teams of that era. They eventually become the New York Yankees, but not directly. The ownership rights for that franchise in Baltimore is sold to New York, and they become a brand new franchise. But the right to be a franchise came from the original Baltimore Orioles, if that makes sense. From 1892 to 1899, the Baltimore Orioles, and in the 1890s, they won 3 National League championships, 3 pennants, 3 World Championships at that time. There was nothing higher than a National League championship. They won in 1894, 95, and 96. And to this day, if you hear the term Baltimore Chop, it comes from the 1890s. That team that eventually ends up being a dead franchise, and the rights are sold to New York to become the Highlanders, the Americans, the Yankees. It all came from the Baltimore Chop in the National League. Who was one of the main players, the most popular player on the team? John McGraw. John McGraw ends up going over to the National League Giants. He was so pissed off about that whole breakup and the American League. That is why in 1904 we do not get a World Series. His Giants won the NL pennant, and he refused to play the American League. 1905, his owner said, "Shut the hell up. There's too much money on the line. We're gonna play." So that's what happened there. But they're all intertwined. I know I nerd out a little bit on this, but I just love the history of baseball. So from 1901, 1902, they're still the Baltimore Orioles, and then they die and they sell the rights to become the Yankees. So it's not the same franchise, but it was the franchise rights. And then we have a couple more to as we end this. Told you I wouldn't be in your hair too long tonight. The Mariners, I thought that was pretty obvious to folks, but just in case, there was actually a contest by fans in 1976. Roger, I'm probably going to mess this word up. The guy that won it was Roger Simotis, and he wrote that they should be named the Mariners due to the natural association between the sea and Seattle. And, of course, they end up getting the colors, the green and the blue, all because of the sea, et cetera, et cetera. But he won contest, received over 15,000 entries. I have a hard time believing he was the only one that picked Mariners, but he's a credit to getting that name. Toronto Blue Jays. Now, remember, before the Mariners, they were the Pilots, different organization. For 1 year, they transfer, go to Milwaukee, and become the Brewers. Why were they named the Brewers? We just went over it because it was an original name of Milwaukee baseball back in 1884. The Toronto Blue Jays, the name originated. This one to me was interesting. I really didn't know what the reasoning why. The Blue Jays was selected because blue was a traditional color for Toronto sports teams. And the bird bird-themed name was chosen, and it aligned with the team's owner at the time, and the colors, the blue, the red, and the white. Labatt Brewing Company owned the rights to the Toronto Blue Jays, and so they were going with those colors. And it was, once again, it was a team contest. The bird theme, the name connects to professional sports teams that used a bird theme all in that area, and they used the colors as a combination, not just for the Labatt Brewing Company, but also, and it's all intertwined, but the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Toronto Argonauts of the CFL. The Detroit Tigers. This one I never would have guessed, because I figured it just had to do with, hey, a ferocious tiger, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, I remember reading some hogwash years ago that it was named because some writer had given it the nickname because they were playing like tigers. Evidently, that whole thing is horse hockey. The Detroit Tigers were named in tribute to the Detroit Light Guard, a Civil War-era military unit, nicknamed the Tigers for their ferocity. And the Detroit newspapers then started using that name for that reason. But what I had read, it had to do with the actual animal. It had nothing to do with the animal per se. It was the unit that fought in the Civil War. And the media started adopting the name for the Tigers as early as 1895. Though it technically was not named. They were not named the Detroit Tigers until 1901. In 1895, 6 years earlier, they were constantly being referred to as the Tigers in newspapers. Chicago Cubs. This is an interesting one. I always wondered why the Cubs came before the Bears. You ever wondered that? The team was originally founded in 1876. They were one of the first teams in the National League that were joining the Braves that were coming over from the National Association. But the Cubs are founded when the National League becomes one. And they had gone through names like the Chicago Orphans, the Chicago Colts, but the origins of the Cubs evidently was after a series of disappointing seasons, they decided to basically rebuild. And in 1902, the Chicago Daily News started referring to them constantly as the Cubs because basically they were babies, right? And they were young, kind of like the baby Braves. And so the next thing you know, by 1907, they become the Chicago Cubs. The St. Louis Cardinals has nothing to do with the bird. St. Louis Cardinals get their nickname origin in 1900 when they start putting a distinctive red trim on the St. Louis jerseys, and supposedly a sports writer overheard a lady in the audience that said, "What a lovely shade of cardinal." You don't see the bird appear in anything until almost a little over 20 years later, in 1922. The baseball bat, the bird on the bat, all that starts in 1922. But for 20 years, the cardinal was the color. It was not the animal. And the athletics, Philadelphia Athletics, well, that was the Philadelphia Athletic Club. That's why they were named that. Now they've become the Kansas City, the Oakland Athletics, and eventually they're going to be they're just the Athletics now, and then they're going to become the Las Vegas Athletics. But why do they use the elephant if they're an athletic team? What the hell does athletics have anything to do with an elephant? It was because the team's owner, Connie Mack, who was also the team manager for over 50 years, he has untouchable records because he owned and managed the team, and he was never going to fire himself. But he took it as a symbol of pride because back then a white elephant was used to describe his team, and it was implying that they were an expensive burden that would fail. Because back in that time period, the white elephant was known as something that you're overpaying for to bring into a circus, but nobody really came for that, and you eventually overpaid for it. Well, that's what he was referring to. Because of that, John McGraw took that as a sense of pride and said, you know what, to hell with you. We are the Elephants. Now, they never took that as a nickname, but they started putting it on their jersey, the white elephant, and that's why the elephant's always white. And of course, their team colors have been green and gold forever. Other odd team names as we wrap this up, and these are teams that are not in Major League Baseball, but these are interesting ones, minor league teams. The Fall River Adopted Sons in the New England League in 1913. Only 5 Fall River players were actually from the state of Massachusetts, so they named the team the Adopted Sons of the Republic. What? All right. There was a Mexican baseball league team called I'll probably mess this up, Saltillo Serape Makers, and I'm probably butchering that name or that word, Serape, but it is a colorful blanket or shawl worn over the shoulders that you typically see in Mexico. That team was named after, kind of like the Green Bay Packers, but their uniforms were god-awful pink-purple colors all over the place. The Oakland Dudes of the California League from 1899 to 1902 referred to a gentleman who was dapperly dressed. That was the original meaning of a dude back in 1899. So they started calling them the Dudes, and they even wore haberdasher hats on the field, if you know what those are. The Petersburg Goobers in the Virginia League for 15 years. Yes, Goobers, like the candy peanut. That's what they were named after. This one's one of the funniest ones. The Bolton Robots of Doom in the British Baseball Federation. It was some kind of science fiction crap, and they they were called the Robots of Doom. It's pretty funny that they would name a team for 9 years. They named them the Memphis Fever Germs. That was in the Southern Association in 1893. This even predates the Spanish flu, but they were called the Fever Germs. And then some of your best nicknames for teams of certain eras. So in other words, like the Big Red Machine of the 1970s Cincinnati Reds. I still think the best one ever was Murderers Row for the New York Yankees because they just had an unbelievable number of Hall of Fame hitters back to back to back. The Miracle Bets of 1969. The Idiots 2004 Red Sox. By the way, any of y'all that had the ESPN Plus and all that, that jumbled together, they've got a new documentary on the 2004 Red Sox. It's pretty damn good. It really is. I've seen a few of these. It's done pretty well. I think I'm about halfway through because I want to say there's 3 episodes. I think I'm about halfway through. 1982 Harvey's Wallbangers. That was named after manager Harvey Quinn. We Are Family Pirates of the 1979 championship team. The 1934 Gas House Gang. Ah, yeah, Richard showing it. The Go-Go White Sox, the Go-Go Sox of 1959. That was because they could not hit home runs. They were constantly stealing bases, hitting runs. They leaned on pitching and defense, and it led to an American League pennant. The Swingin' A's of the early 1970s Athletics. The Evil Empire. I think everybody knows that one. That was the Yankees for about 20 years, from about 1990. We'll say 1995 to about around 2011-ish. This was a great one. 1984. I remember the team. I didn't know the reference in the nickname. 1984, the Bless You Boys. The name has its roots from Detroit sportscaster Al Ackerman sarcastically saying the year before, when the team snapped a long losing streak, at the end of the game he said, "Bless you, boys." They took that nickname and ran with it in 84, and as opposed to being one of the worst teams in baseball, in 84 they won 35 of their first 40. They became the Bless You Boys, and they rode it all the way to a World Series with Sparky Anderson. the Broad Street Bellies of the 1993 Phillies. John Kruk famously said, I ain't an athlete, I'm a baseball player. They were kind of known as an out-of-shape bunch and whatnot, and it was in playoff words of the 1970s hockey team in Philadelphia, the Broad Street Bullies. But they are the Broad Street Bellies that made it all the way to the World Series. Of course, they got walked off by Joe Carter. The Black Sox of 1919, we've gone over that before. You know why that is. This is a cool one. I don't even remember. This is just a handful of years ago. In 2017, if you remember when the Cleveland Indians won 22 games in a row, to tie the AL record, they were nicknamed the Windians. And then in '78, all the turmoil, but they still won the title. The Bronx Zoo of the New York Yankees, the Blake Street Bombers, 1995, Colorado Rockies. That was because Blake Street was right behind the Colorado Stadium, and you had guys like Dante Bichette, which is Sons out there on the free agent market, Vinny Castilla, the Big Cat, Andres Galarraga, Larry Walker, a Hall of Famer. They all hit 30 home runs or more, and they were the first team to do that. Now, granted, it was in Colorado. The Boys of Summer and Dim Bums, well, that was the 1950s Dodgers. 1906, I think this is up there with the Murderers Row. 1906 Chicago White Sox were known as the Hitless Wonders because they had a batting average of just .230, which is worse than the American League. It was second worst in all of baseball, but yet they beat a heavily favored Chicago Cubs team literally with pitching and defense. They were winning all these games like 2-1, 1-0, and they're known as the Hitless Wonders. The Cardiac Kids, that moniker was originally given to the 1967 Boston Red Sox. I know a lot of teams try to grab it nowadays. You'll see football teams try to, the Heart Attack Pack, all that kind of stuff. No, the original thing was the Cardiac Kids of 1967. They won the American League pennant, and they did it in just unbelievable fashion, night after night, walk-offs and whatnot. This is another great one for the Reds. 1990, the Nasty Boys. Dibble, Myers, what was the other guy? Norm Charlton, the Nasty Boys, and remember they went wire to wire that year and swept Jose Canseco and Mark McGuire's Oakland A's, which people at the time thought were an unbeatable team. And then what's dear to my heart, and this is how we'll end it, 2021, the night shift, baby. That bullpen, the Braves rode that bullpen all the way to a World Series. See if anybody's got any questions or comments. Remember, tomorrow, 9 a.m., MLB Today, and 10 a.m., Braves Country Today. We're going to open them both up to the public, but you are going to have to be a member to comment on Braves Country Today because just wanting to keep the shows tighter, and you got to give folks who continue to support our channel, you got to give them something that some kind of incentive to continue to support us. We've got that going on tomorrow, and then also tomorrow night, same situation. We've got Braves Country Theater. And that's going to be a lot of fun because I still don't know the final score of this game. I don't even know who the hell's pitching. I told one of the guys at the race, I said, go find me one. I was like, just make sure it's not a crap fest. I don't want a boring baseball game, and we're going to go from there. And if you just joined us and you didn't catch it at the very beginning, we are planning on doing some of the Caribbean League baseball games in December, and even into late November, possibly next week if he reports. Ronald Acuna Jr.'s Venezuelan team. And we're going to see if we can find other games that match up that we're going to do. We're going to do a few a week, and those should be a lot of fun. See. Yes, I'm sure. I was wondering if you were in here, Reddy. I don't remember that nickname, but I thought it was a really cool nickname. Yeah, the We Are family. Richard, yeah, that's to me that's right before I started watching baseball. I was just a little too young for that. But I was aware of it. When I was growing up, my first season of watching Major League Baseball in its entirety was like 82 into 83. I remember the 81 World Series-ish, but I definitely remember the 82 World Series, Harvey Wallbangers versus the Cardinals. By 83, I was absorbing every game I could of the Atlanta Braves. But I was very aware of the We Are family. It's funny, though, when you're that age, when you're a young kid, and someone's referring to a team that just played 3-4 years before you started watching, you think it's forever ago, right? You just, in your mind, you're like, well, that was before I was around. But anyways, those teams back then, I think that's one of the things that we miss nowadays are the cool nicknames. I try to do my best when we're doing games, but I wish it would become more of a thing, because I thought baseball has the greatest nicknames, not just the team names, but also players' names and whatnot. I'm definitely well before the Big Red Machine. The Big Red Machine, they were still calling him that in the 80s, early, but they were gone. Because, I mean, hell, Pete Rose is on the 83 Phillies that won the NL pennant. Joe Morgan was on that team as well. All those guys had already left. But you would still hear, I mean, I hear my grandfather reference them as the Big Red Machine. I'm like, I don't know, man. Big Red Machine. You might need some more oil or whatnot. Yeah, it was the early to mid. Actually started in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, Richard. The Reds had a run of about 7 or 8 years. So I think that's all we got. I think we're going to wind this sucker down. Appreciate everybody stopping in, and we'll see you tomorrow. Once again, 9 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Eastern. We're doing MLB today and Braves Country today back to back. We're just going to bang, bang, knock them out. And then tomorrow night should be a lot of fun. It is Braves versus Phillies, and we'll put the link in the chat so you can follow along on a separate device and whatnot. See if anyone's got anything else. If not, we gonna get out of here. Charlie says he was here before the Atlanta Braves, and Charlie was a Boston Red Stockings fan back in 1871. He was there. He was the original. In fact, he was in one of those pictures that I just showed. Y'all have a good one. Love y'all. See you tomorrow.
Goodbye, sweetheart, well, it's time to go. We're back tomorrow with another show. Well, unless we're fired, we'll talk to you then. Goodbye, sweetheart, goodbye. Goodbye.
Guys and gals, it's time to go. We'll see you on the next show.
Same bat time, same bat channel.
It's closing time, y'all. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Have a great one. On your way out, please like and subscribe, and don't forget to tip your favorite bartender. We'll see you. I'm Mac McGee, signing off for Braves Country Radio.